9:04, and I would like to call the meeting to order and begin roll call with Marcia.
Marcia Raggio, audiologist, board member.
Karen Chang, public member.
Rodney Diaz, otolaryngologist, public board member.
Dee Parker, speech-language pathologist, board member.
Todd Borges, hearing aid dispenser, board member.
And welcome, Todd. Debbie.
Snow, public member. I understood you're having the committee first, so that's why I'm down here.
Yes, we were just calling roll for the general board meeting.
Yep. And we've established a quorum, so we can turn this over to Marcia.
Should I stay over here?
Oh, no,
No,
not
good.
over here.
So we'll have the committee members stay up here on the dais and yes.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the Audiology Practice Committee. I don't know if we have to identify ourselves for that or not.
No.
So is Christy here?
No.
Okay, Karen Chang, public member, here.
Rod Diaz, otolaryngologist, public.
Okay, Marcia Raggio, board member, audiologist. Okay, I guess that's it. I believe the first topic we're going to talk about is the possible action. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I guess before we get started with that, is there any public comment on any issues that are not on the agenda? Seeing none? I guess we'll move on then. Okay. That's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. So discussion of possible action on clarifying the regulation of the required number of clock hours for audiologists under tab number 3. We talked about this last time. Two issues that are at the center of this. One is that the current regulation, or current law, actually says that we only have to have 300 clock hours, which was taken from the time when audiologists earned master's degree as their terminal degree. Now that we have to have a clinical doctorate, looking around the country and the recommendations from the national organizations, most agencies are asking for about 1,800 hours, so we need to make a change in that. And that, as far as I understand, is a simple regulatory change. Not that that's ever simple, but that's the idea with that. But the other problem is that the current law says that you have to complete this in no less than 12 months. And as we learned from UOP and some other entities, that sometimes people earn their hours in much less than that, maybe not much less, but 10 and a half months, something like that. But this says you have to stay on the job for 12 months. So we have two problems to deal with. And I believe the staff did take a stab at trying to establish us in regulation of having 1,850 hours. But that's possible that we could do that. But if we want to change that 12-month thing, and it seems pretty critical that we do, then we're going to have a legislative change to that statute. So that's where we're bringing it back to decide that. None of this is painless either way, but it seems like it has to be done. So is there any discussion, any thoughts about?
I wasn't quite sure from the last discussion why in the BNP code, the first section, it says 1850 hours, and then the next page, 100.
That's what I was going to ask as well.
You know, I don't know that
I forgot why or if.
And I wasn't here for that discussion.
and I'm not sure why. I think this was put in by staff.
Are we talking about the discrepancy between the proposed statute of 1850 and the...
And then there's a different California
Right,
code regulation.
right. I think we just need to decide what it should be, and it should be one of the two.
One or the other.
Right.
From what I can tell, whether this, has any gravity or not, but most institutions are asking for 1,800 hours, not 1,850. It's kind of a moot issue in that regard.
We were trying to calculate all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, 1,800 seemed reasonable. I don't see what.
Yeah,
what the extra
that was
50
the 10 and a half month at 40 hours a week at 4.3 weeks per month. So I think 1,800 is reasonable, and in compliance with with most.
It's a lot more than 300.
Yeah, it certainly is, and it's not hard to do that. In fact, as Jackie was telling us, with the whole program taken together, they're earning 2,500 hours, but you can't count those. Only the RPE hours.
Right. Just the third and fourth year, not the other stuff in the beginning.
Right, or even the third or fourth year, depending on how long your program is.
Right.
So that's not hard to do. It's that other, and I don't know how difficult it is, but I think we have to say, have new language about the 12-month. Maybe not more than, not instead of not less than.
Well, that would make it difficult as well, because then if people were in a program where they spent more than 12 months, then that would put them in a bind as well. So.
It would. And I don't know how many people are in that, but that contingency is out there as well. So perhaps just not saying.
Just sticking with 1,800.
But even that requires, I would assume, a statutory change, even to say nothing. We have to take out the that language.
Take out the 12 months.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know. What do you think, Paul?
Well,
or Sabina?
Well, because your reg is going to make this statute a little bit more specific, did you want to remove any reference to the amount of time or months and say something to the effect of submit evidence of satisfactory completed supervised professional experience obtained under the supervision? And then your reg could clarify what that is.
I think that's what we've done.
Yeah, I think the changes look really good. I think the only discrepancy I saw was just the 1,850 versus 1,800.
Right. I'm just saying, we want to keep hours or months in there, or we want to remove that and have the reg say it?
The intent was to remove that, right, Charisse?
Because it's still in there.
The intent I had in there was to use the 1,800 hours, and that's usually, it seems that the legislature wants to put in a number of hours or a max, and that's why I put that in there. And then your reg would just qualify the rest of it. I left out anything about the months because it seemed like you could go over or under, and that became problematic and a barrier to entry, so I just got rid of that. Sorry, Bryce. I just had that feeling I was looking over.
I think so long as we make it clear that we're talking about only the RPE hours and no others, then there isn't any confusion about just using hours. Because some people would say, well, I already gained, 500 hours earlier in the program with supervised, work. And
doesn't that take care of it? The supervisor?
I think it does, and I think I can see where you're going, Sabina, with removing any mention of it and putting it all into reg, so the statute is vague in general, and then the reg is very explicit. In general, they've seemed to want to put it in the statute, a cap somewhere in there, so it seemed appropriate to put it there, but we can always remove that and absolutely go with all the definitions being in the regulation.
Or you could say no, submit evidence, well, because if you say no less than 1,800.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reg would qualify which year you're accruing it in.
Right.
Yeah.
in fourth year.
Because right now it doesn't specify which year. It just says 1850. So just change it to 1800. All the other changes are consistent.
I think this 3 different clinical experiences comes right out of ASHA, and I don't know how applicable it is anymore. These people go to their 4th year experience and generally stay there like a residency. They see a variety of people, but it depends on where they go. So if you went to a VA, for example, if that's where you got your RPE or your fourth year, perhaps you won't see children. So I think that's restrictive to make them say that.
So you feel that the three different clinical experiences is outdated as well?
Yeah, I just don't think it's realistic. In the old days, we used to do 50 hours here, 50 hours there, some 100 hours there, and it worked. But I don't think it's appropriate anymore.
So that language was trying to clarify the statutory language that talks about the wide spectrum of ages and audiological disorders.
And yeah, we might wish that, and that would be good for training purposes, but when you get they're so coveted to get a fourth year, and you have to leave the state sometimes to get them, that insisting that you have a variety of patients, I don't know how realistic that is, those profiles are.
I think in drafting this, we definitely just kept with what the reg was above it, since there was no indication the 3 settings was an issue, so.
Yeah, it again comes from the old days when that's what you had to do.
I remember this discussion years ago.
So this is a regulatory change to take that out, the three.
3 different clinical settings.
Yeah.
Correct.
So the one statutory issue is the 12-month.
Correct.
So how might we?
So did you want to say submit evidence of no less than 1,800 hours of satisfactorily completed supervised professional experience obtained under the supervision? You just want to keep it like that with 1,800 for the statute, and then take out the 3 clinical settings in the reg. So
And remove the number 2 from 2532.25B, submit evidence of no less than 12 months.
So we're looking at this?
Yeah, she just read it
Right.
without any of the strike-throughs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I like taking that out too.
Mhm. So that's our first stab at the proposed language.
Yeah.
So then I guess the question,
1,800.
right, when we look at the regulation, the proposed regulatory language on the next page, we can remove the 3 different clinical settings, but the question is, do we need to address clarifying the wide spectrum of ages and audiological disorders, or do we just leave it as is?
will that still be covered by their program?
I think it's covered by the program, but I would be uncomfortable with the idea of stipulating it that has to be part of the 4th year experience, the externship. It's just not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard enough to get one setting. Now, it could be that you'll work in an environment where that's appropriate, but not everywhere.
And just strike. You can strike.
So the
that.
current process,
Yeah.
the current process is the way we ensure that someone submits evidence is the purpose of that regulation is to clarify that, I guess is what I'm saying.
If you remove.
I don't know that it matters if we remove it, does it?
Which one, the BP code or the reg?
The reg.
Well, in the reg, we are making more specific and clarifying the business and profession code by adding in, it must be in 3 different clinical settings. So if you're following the reg, when you receive somebody's experience and you're not seeing 3 different clinical settings, you technically don't meet that requirement.
That's actually new language that hasn't been in there before.
Oh, that hasn't.
I thought it
Is
was.
that correct?
I thought
That's a
it was.
question.
No, that's actually taken from the previous regulatory language that was there.
Yeah.
So
And
it's-
that language comes from when speech language pathology and audiology requirements were the same.
But it wasn't in this section before.
It wasn't, but it's not in this. It's not in this section. It was in a different section.
Right.
Right.
It's in a different
Okay.
section.
So we would be back in the same place. If you went to go to approve somebody's hours and you didn't see the 3 different clinical settings, you would not be meeting the requirements.
So if we removed it from this section,
Mhm.
would we have to remove it from whatever other section it was also in before?
What was the other section?
I'm just saying, I mean, if we're getting this language.
No,
from
I actually,
the other section.
I actually think that, I don't think it's an issue whether we take it out, because this is proposed language. It doesn't exist there now, right? We could just remove it from our,
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, where, if you're saying we got the 3 different clinical settings language from another regulation.
Like a speech
Right.
pathology regulation?
Yeah.
Or,
That's a speech pathology regulation.
Oh, that's
Well,
still in there.
They're both, these are for both, right? So it's speech, language, and audiology. And C, which we were going to call C1, we're just removing audiologists from it and leaving that speech, language, pathology and not touching that 3 settings for them.
I think the question is, where did that 3 clinical settings come from originally and what reg?
Right.
Because the question is, do we have to look at that there also?
Right.
Do we want to also, in the future, maybe not today since it's not agendized,
Right.
maybe we want to look at removing that barrier also, or that issue. Maybe it's antiquated, maybe it's not needed anymore.
You might. I think it stems from the statute in B1, which is the wide spectrum of ages and audiological disorders. So it's-
Right, but I think it's actually in another reg somewhere else, and I remember years ago, I just can't recall off the top of
Which
my
one
head
of
right
it
now.
is? Yeah.
But let's, I think we can add that to a list of something to look into for staff and for legal,
Okay.
to do a little search and figure out where that is in other regs.
Okay.
We can bring it back to you guys.
Okay, in terms of making a statutory change then, that process is always a little daunting.
Right, so today, if you wanted to recommend changes to the full board would then review your recommendation and decide to then, that at that time, the motion would be to direct the EO to find an author or to pursue the legislative change and the regulatory change as well, if you also recommend that.
So we can't really recommend the entirety right now because they still have to look at where else.
no, we
No,
can.
we're just doing what we're looking at.
Hold on, we can do that. You as a committee can make a recommendation right now, and you can recommend that we continue
Okay.
deciding whether or not we want to remove the 3 clinical settings. So I think we're talking about 2 different things. We have the proposed statutory change, which I think is necessary, but then I think we also have to. I think it would be a good idea to come to the board with some language, and now would be an appropriate time for us to do it. We don't have to flesh out the language. We don't have to approve the language. We're proposing something to the board, making a recommendation.
We're both in support of that.
And just for clarification, the three clinical settings, I just wanted to address that. The 3 clinical settings is currently in regulation. And so what I think we have to do is just decipher what the difference is between the requirements for an audiologist and a speech-language pathologist. Because currently, for speech-language pathology, it is required in 3 clinical settings. And as I understand that, you said, maybe that came from ASHA requirements. But we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about what the requirements would be for audiology. So if we don't want to propose that audiologist, that we require 3 clinical settings, I think it's a good idea that we don't do that in regulation. Because that would then require us to start requiring that as a qualification for licensure. So if we already know that as part of their curriculum they're doing that, we may not need to address that in regulation.
I think, do you guys have your law books with you?
Yeah.
I think a little bit of confusion has happened here in this, the way it's underlined, because it's not showing that 3 clinical settings as original language. So if you turn to page
84.
84, you'll see that in subsection C, the words 3 different clinical settings are already in there. I have a computer.
Right.
It looks like new, but it's not.
How do you know it isn't?
Because we're looking at the law book right now, and it's in section C on page 84.
Yeah, I see it.
So I think what we really need to do right now is just decide what we want that language to be, and then we can present that as a recommendation to the board.
I have a question. Since the 3 regulations weren't isn't up for discussion, wouldn't that be on the next agenda, and then we would only talk about the 1,800 versus 1,850 hours?
Can you repeat that again?
So since on this sheet we're only talking about the hours, really, right? Should we also include the 3 subsections? I don't know. Am I even making sense? Yeah, 3 clinical settings.
3 clinical settings.
Yeah.
I think all this language is open for you guys'
Oh, okay.
discussion and edit to make a recommendation to the full board.
Okay.
Since, yeah,
So I
12
guess-
months was removed.
So I guess in the regulations section, like you were saying, Sabina, it's confusing because of the way it's underlined.
Right, it looks like it's new language.
It looks like it's all new language, but it's not new. It's not new language. So
Right.
that's sort of where I
I
was
see.
getting confused.
Yeah.
So
That's
it
why-
would just have to be rewritten so that the speech language pathologist requirement be divorced from the audiologist requirement.
If that's what you wish.
Right.
So I think we would leave C alone as it is, and I might be oversimplifying this, but if we're looking at our law book, we would leave the requirement under C as it is, and then we would add a requirement for audiologist.
Well, but C has both speech language pathologist or audiologist.
In it.
So
And
we
that's
have
why I
to
drafted you with
remove
C1.
audiologist from C.
I think that's why I've drafted it in this way, so that C1 addresses just speech-language pathologists or an audiologist who completed their program prior to that 2007 date, which I believe is when the doctoral requirement became applicable. So that way, because you do occasionally get applicants that got the degree long ago and then are coming back. So I'm trying to be cognizant of that. So C1 would apply to the same rules that would have applied to their degree back in before December 31st of 2007. And then all audiologists that graduate after that would be part of C2.
Okay.
So that's why there's a little bit of confusion, because
Oh,
you could
okay.
still have people that got their degree
I got it.
and before then. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
Thank you.
No problem.
It was
So do
right there
we-
in front of me.
It's okay.
So do we need to edit this to address the speech language pathology qualifications as they are today?
It leaves those intact. So it leaves speech-language pathology as it was, so that's C1, and then it would change it for audiologists that graduated after December 31st, 2007 in C2. So C1, all speech-language pathology and any audiology master's graduates before December of 2007, and then anybody after that,
Okay.
C2.
Yep, got it.
I know it'll get a little confusing, and I'm sure the messaging to applicants and licensees will also need to be there, but it seemed
So then
the
it-
easier split instead of a C and then a D and then renumbering, and then,
Yeah.
oh yeah, but what about those that graduated prior? And
I read it. That actually,
Yeah.
that made
Yeah.
perfect sense the first time I read it, and then
So then all we have to do is remove the 3
Right.
clinical settings from the.
I think from C2.
Yes.
Yes.
because it's still present in
Yes.
C1 where
Exactly.
it was all along.
Yes.
I didn't see it.
Yes.
Exactly.
But there it is.
Okay.
And
Right.
presumably those people completing their degree back then were on the 3 setting. That was the rules
Right.
generally, and it would still be okay.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Great, so we have the change in the B&P code section, to the change in hours to 1,800 from 1,850. And then we have the other change on the next page under C2, removing in 3 different clinical settings.
Yeah, and Karen and I supported that.
So am I making a recommendation at this point?
You can open it up for discussion from any public members, and then you can make a motion to recommend to the full board, should you like to do
I
that.
hope yeah. Anyway, is there any further discussion from the public?
Linda Pippard, speech-language pathologist. I just had a question. Under the supervised clinical experience, that is hours that speech-language pathologists get during their graduate program. So for the audiologists, this 1,800 hours is now included in that doctoral program?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
That's kind of a good point in the fact that, as far as we know, all California programs included in their programs. There are some out-of-state programs for which you graduate, then you go seek this elsewhere. So that's an issue, but not so far here.
Okay, yeah, that answers that. So then they don't do a, quote, audiology RPE after this 800 hours?
800?
1,800?
No.
Okay,
This is
that
the
includes
RPE.
it all.
As far as I know.
Because the 375 hours that the speech pathologists do, that's required during their graduate program, and then they go on to do the 36 weeks of supervised.
It's quite a different model.
Yeah. Okay.
That whole CF idea is kind of incorporated into the program itself.
Thank you for explaining that.
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure what I'm recommending, but as far as I know, we want to make both regulatory and statutory changes. Regulatory having to do with 1,800 hours instead of 300 hours. We want to remove the 3 clinical settings, and in statute, we need to remove the idea that this all has to be accomplished in 12 months. So I think we're recommending that staff work on, I guess, cleaning up and/or amending the language.
So they're going to make those.
Suggested.
They're going to make those edits, and then you can recommend that that the full board consider this language.
Yeah, so that's my that's my recommendation. Yes, is that the staff, amend the language, clean it up, bring it back, and the full board will take a look at it at that point.
Is that your motion?
That's if that's a motion, that's my motion.
Second.
Okay, shall we vote?
Yes.
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 Good job.
Okay. So the next issue is a little bit more complicated, and that is discussion and possible action regarding statutory and regulatory changes defining specific tasks of an audiology aid. And we did discuss this at our last board meeting, the issue being that there's some confusion out there in terms of people who employ audiology aids, we call them, although the professional organizations almost always exclusively refer to them as audiology assistants. But they're audiology aids in California in terms of what kind of tasks they can do that are in the interests of consumer protection versus those that they shouldn't be doing. And it was unclear to those out there in terms of what they could and couldn't do. So I looked at a number of issues, but also looked at the language from the American Academy of Audiology as well as ASHA in terms of how they define and see the role of an audiology assistant. Our notion was, can we list clinical activities that an audiology aid can do, and should we list those that they can't do? And we took this up many years ago, and it was very difficult to capture everything or to agree upon what they can and can't do. So we're still at that point of not knowing what they can and can't do. But there is some suggested language, perhaps in the ASHA document, that was included in the hand carry, or you sent it by email, that showed these two, that showed lists of can and can't. What both of these agencies saying, and it's not that California has to abide by what professional organizations say, but the notion of an assistant to begin with, many years ago when this idea first came forward, is that they wanted to have a class of help that could free up an audiologist to do more substantive, more difficult, more I guess, weighty kinds of clinical tasks and make decisions. And if they had somebody who could help them do the setup, get everything ready, things like that, but not make any decisions, not do any diagnostic procedures and so on, that would be helpful. And that's where this came from. We needed helpers to free up audiologists so they could do the weightier things. And they both documents say that, both AAA and ASHA, that was the goal. Some ASHA says, and they have different language in their statements here in terms of the idea being that these aides should be trained, and it's under the responsibility of the provider, of the audiologist who's supervising, to decide what they can and can't do, to get them trained to a level of skill that they feel comfortable leaving them to do. Well, we said last time, and I felt pretty strongly about it, that the language was clear, that you had to be physically present. But that is, the supervisor did. But then it became, what is physically present? Is that over the shoulder physically present? Is that in the next room? Is it in the building? Not in your car, not down the road, but somewhere in the vicinity. So if there was a problem, you'd be right there to solve it or deal with it. So that's why we couldn't come to a decision on what is physically present, the way it currently reads. So in looking through all these documents by AAA and by ASH and so on, and also by the discussion from our last meeting, if we insist that supervision be over the shoulder, then why have an assistant at all?
Exactly.
Because if you have to do it, if you have to stand there and make sure that they do it, you're not meeting the letter of ASHA or AAA in that sense of freeing you up. You're not freed up to do anything but watch this person. So I kind of agree with that it's, we should reinterpret physically present so that they're close by, literally, perhaps in the same office, but not make it over the shoulder. So we're still at that point of looking at that. And I think Sharice did a good job of laying out the issues and the problem with it. But we have to do something because there's too much confusion out there about what is consumer protection, what isn't. Some people feel that they can train up an assistant to do some pretty significant diagnostic tasks. And so long as that supervisor feels, yep, they've got it, they know how to do it, I can go out to lunch now, is probably not the way to go. But on the other hand, can they get them up to speed so that they could go to the next patient in the next room over? Is that okay? So this is a more complex issue to try to decide. So those are kind of the issues as I see them. How do we attack this?
And I think it coming from a different board as well and hearing different legal opinions, it's always difficult to decide which direction is the better route to go. Making lists of what you can do tends to leave out things that technology makes available later. The field changes and eventually that becomes outdated again. Lists of can't do, you just, when you're introducing a reg, we're going to need to be very specific of why. What's the patient risk? These are the reasons these are outside of the scope. These are absolutely part of the audiologist's scope and they're comprehensive and diagnostic and they should never be doing them. And I think in looking at, as I'm of course new, I was taking a look at some of the other reg packages where I think it's the SLPA that are looking at different levels of supervision, and maybe that is something where, in reading some of ASHA and AA, it's weird to call it AAA, but I guess AAA.
Yeah, I know.
Their guidance was kind of, at first you may need to be directly supervising as you're training, and then certain things you can go to indirect, and maybe there's certain things that this board decides are extremely critical and have high risk and should never be done outside of the direct supervision of the audiologist. So you're in the same room, but maybe you're doing different tasks, but they're right there. So there's a variety of ways it can be tackled. Not being new to the policy in the field, I think we would want to flesh it out a lot more. But those are kind of generally the two directions one can go, unless you want the more broad language like you have now, which also you could incorporate language from the ethics codes about supervision and the requirements thereof, and that they not include anything that is diagnostic, evaluative, or something like that. So those are kind of the variety of options. It leaves much more room, but it sounds like the interpretation and room you have now is what's causing the problem. So I think I was hoping to just kind of put out there like all the things that the committee's going to want to think about, bring out to the field, get input on from the community, that kind of information. So.
I like what she said, because just looking at attachment D, I think it was from ASHA, like greeting, escorting patients. You don't need an actual audiologist for that. I think an aide can be there. But then other things that I'm reading that are the types of services that are permitted with the assistant is like performing tasks with pediatric patients, right? So what she mentioned was instead of doing over the shoulder, whatnot, would it be more like diagnostic evaluations? Those need to be where an audiologist is present. And then where it includes stuff like greeting and escorting patients, scheduling patients, maintaining, stocking tests, test and treatment rooms, or assisting patients with case history or forms, performing equipment maintenance. Maybe those you don't need an over-the-shoulder type audiologist. And I know we don't want to get into specifics, so we can say something like, if it requires evaluation or diagnostic, an audiologist should be present. And then if it doesn't, like greeting patients or interacting with hearing manufacturers or ordering status.
I kind of like Asha's list in terms of not as a suggestion that these are the types of tasks that they should do or could do. These are the types of tasks that they shouldn't be doing. And then leave it to the supervisors to determine, which one. But there's some language in the ASHA recommendations that say supervision is comprehensive, periodic, and documented. Periodic. So that says that they are leaving quite a responsibility to the supervisor. And are we okay with that? Do we think people will abuse that and have people be doing things they shouldn't be doing? Even though we're saying you have all this responsibility, and we use that in lots of licensure issues. It's your responsibility. If you don't follow the rules, then you're in violation of that. So we put the onus on the provider, or on the supervisor. Mm-hmm. And we trust that they're going to do the right thing. Are we in a position to do that here as well?
I would say in general, in past discussions, providing exhaustive lists have not been the recommendation. And so providing the can and can't do list at the same time probably is not something you would maybe want to go down that route.
That was the conclusion we came to last time.
Yeah.
So where do we go then if we don't have lists?
I think, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. I think one of the ways, and especially that Ms. Chang was mentioning it, is that you could have categories of activities that the aides can do and that need direct supervision, as in the audiologist needs to be in the room, and indirect supervision or periodic supervision. So you could define levels of supervision and the types of tasks that would be in there. And then, of course, everything still meets the training and competency requirements that are part of the supervision.
Yeah. We've been there before.
Looking at the aid designation, I think it's really important to kind of understand what it is and what it isn't. An aid is someone that is registered, that is assisting a licensee, and they're registered by the licensee as someone who is assisting or aiding them. So it's not really the same as a speech-language pathology assistant, because that person comes with training and education requirements. And an aid really is just someone, it's a way for us to ensure consumer protection, to know the person that is working in that office, in that setting. So looking back, 5 years ago or 4 years ago, we were talking about this. I think having the experience that I have now and that we have, I think it really makes it difficult to leave it as it is. But if we're not going to identify some type of list, for lack of a better term, or something that says this is what an audiology aid can do or can't do, then we really don't need to do anything. Because we already have regulations that say a supervisor needs to tell us what the person's going to be doing, what their training plan is. But does that really ensure consumer protection? We've addressed the issues with hearing aid dispensing trainees because we saw that there was a little bit of a gap that we needed to make sure that we were protecting consumers when it came to supervision. So I think the same applies here. If we think that there is an issue where an aide who has no training requirements, no educational requirements, could possibly be doing something that can cause consumer harm, then we need to make sure that we've identified that and articulated it in regulation. That's what I think.
I mean, the way ASHA lays it out, these are suggestions. They don't say you can or can't. These are suggestions, and it does leave it to the responsibility of the supervisor to find that task in here and find out what to do. We did try this supervisor, I swear, about, I don't know how many years ago, and we ultimately dropped it because it was just so difficult to pigeonhole activities. But on the other hand, if we don't,
Yeah.
I think, again, I go back to looking back, I think, yeah, we may not get it. It may not be perfect. It may not be the all-encompassing, exhaustive list of what a person does or can't do. But I think at the same time, from an enforcement standpoint, from a licensing standpoint, it makes it really difficult when you don't have anything to base that on. Mm-hmm. So if we come up with something that addresses most of the issues, that addresses some major concerns that we might have. I know some people have raised concerns about dispensing, and how does that come into play with aids? So I think we're at a point where maybe we really need to look at this and come up with something.
Your ASHA says, audiology practices encourage and permit trainees to assume increasing levels of responsibility commensurate with their individual progress, experience, skills, knowledge, and judgment, provided those responsibilities remain within the scope appropriate for a trainee.
And I think the hard part is it sounds like on the audiology side as compared to the speech-language pathology side, there's kind of this ladder effect where there is entry level, right off the street, high school graduate learning. There's the next level where you have some education and training and you become an SLPA. And this is just my very brand new, 3 weeks view of it. But that's not there on the audiology side, where there should be maybe a differentiation between somebody without any formal education in audiology shouldn't be performing said tasks at all. And then those with enough training and education could be performing these and maybe performing them with indirect supervision upon so many hours of training or something along those kind of lines. And that might kind of ease that consumer protection part because you're ensuring that to do certain higher level functions, there's a certain amount of training, a certain amount of education. But again, it does sound like the aid, the audiology aid, was not quite created for that purpose as compared to the...
But that reminds me, I sent you a copy of the curriculum for the Cal State LA program that Dee Parker mentioned last time. I looked that up to see, and they're training people to do quite a number of diagnostic tasks within that and giving them a certificate when they're done. In terms of education, I don't know if there's any other assistant program or audiology aids program out there, but they're presumably handing out that certificate right now.
So they're creating a market for us that we're not quite regulatorily ready to put into a category.
For audiology aids.
It's for audiology assistants, right? I think that's the term they use.
Yeah, probably because they're ASHA bred.
So I think it's kind of mirroring the speech language pathology assistant program.
Exactly.
And it can be problematic if you're leading students to believe that somehow this is going to lead to licensure when no such license exists.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they may be qualified based on their education to do it, they're still not legally able to do this in California. Right.
Because it's kind of a difference, a huge difference there.
That's odd that Cal State LA didn't talk to a state, us, about it. To just,
I think it's there's some language in there about meeting state requirements or some. I don't have it in front of me, but if you do, I send it to you.
Pull my laptop.
It's some language like that.
But there's no state requirements for that.
No.
Yeah, so.
You have to make one.
Yeah, but I think there is language to that effect in there.
And sometimes there's confusion about state licensing board requirements and what are, professional organization certifications or requirements.
Exactly.
And the other issue was about continuing education, that we thought, or somebody thought, and these people think, that is Ashton AAA, that they should, audiology assistants or audiology aids should undergo continuing ed. And I don't know where the forum or the venue is for that, for them, but. Pardon?
Are they not licensed by us or registered? They're not
They're
registered.
registered, yes.
They're
but
registered.
They are.
You're talking about aids now, right?
Aids.
Yes.
Yes, audiologists, yes. But
Not-
for an audiology aid to find continuing education that's appropriate for them, we'd have to do some thinking about that, because usually the whole idea of a conference is to not give you basic information. It is to advance your knowledge of something, and they're way behind in terms of that.
Well, thank goodness that's not on our plate today.
Oh,
I was going to say, that might be off the agenda topic.
So we're going to, yeah.
But
Okay.
actually, going back to the audiology aid issue, I think that as part of our discussion, the audiology aid designation, going back to what it is and what it isn't, it's a one-time registration.
Mm-hmm.
It was obviously established not under the same model as other licenses. So we register someone for a very minimal fee. There's no renewal requirement. So we do ask that supervisors update their training plan or what they're doing. So we have to proactively go out and reach out to people and ask them, can you make sure that this person still working with you? Because the way it was set up, there's no renewal requirement. So if there's no renewal requirement, there's no continuing education requirement that goes along with that. I think that when we went to the Sunset Committee last time, we did present the issue as to whether aids, the aid designation was obsolete or not, whether it's something that, I think we find that it's still used on the audiology side more so than on the speech-language pathology side. But I think this does kind of beg the question on another scale as to whether something is evolving. There's this need on the audiology side, maybe something mirroring what we have with assistants, or some type of registration that does require renewal and does require education or continuing education, something along those lines. And that could be something that we might want to look at for Sunset.
but only then, not for anything more immediate.
I mean, Sunset's
pretty
coming
soon,
up, yes.
We would essentially need to prepare that this year.
I mean, I do think we need to address this issue, but I think there's a bigger issue that we need to look at too. And I think, frankly, that's what this committee is about. That's what we should be talking about.
Would that require any work at this point then to try to perhaps meld degrees of supervision with suggested tasks now, or as part of the Sunset?
Well, I think that we have the current issue that's in front of us, and that's dealing with what are we going to do with the audiology aids to help clarify for the licensees out there that are using this type of designation for their aids, because the law basically says anybody that's helping in this area, whatever you call them, they need to be registered as aids with the board. That's what they're supposed to be doing. So I think we need to address that to help educate the licensing community, but also primarily to ensure consumer protection. So I think we need to address that, and then I think we need to also look at the bigger picture of what this aid designation should be.
Okay, so there is an immediate need then?
So it depends what the committee wants to do. So if you like the idea of figuring out categories, and then within those categories of tasks, the type of supervision might be required, or if you really want to go down the road of either a negative list or a positive list, and then you can either ask a committee member to work with staff to help them flesh that out and bring it back next time. So you have a couple different options, depending on what you'd like to do.
I wish I knew.
I know. Wish it were easier, right?
That's why you have your committee, and I think that's something that...
It feels like
think.
it's going to be a lose-lose because both a negative and a positive list is
Yes.
going to be problematic.
Yes, we did that. Many years ago, we tried that.
Yeah. But I feel like for me personally, I feel like I'm kind of in a vacuum because I don't know for the licensees that are supervisors. Do we know whether they want? Do more of them want a negative list? Do they want a negative list, or would they be happier with a negative list, or would they be happier with a positive list? Is there a way to find out what our licensees would rather have to help guide them?
Well, if we came up with some suggested changes, it has to go for public comment. That's how we're going to engender that. I actually like the way ASHA did it because it's very detailed.
Well, they have,
It makes
ASHA
sense.
has both a negative and a positive
They
list.
do.
So we could.
I was wondering, is it possible to just say Audiology Aids can do things according to ASHA's list, and since ASHA can change their list whenever they want, we kind of move along with ASHA. You know, it doesn't it's not like we have our own list. We say do it according to ASHA's list. And so 10 years from now, ASHA has a new list. We don't have to change anything because it's still according to.
Except we've worked long and hard to separate ourselves from professional organizations dictating what California does.
Yeah.
So it took us many years to get the language of ASHA out of our laws and regulations. I don't want to say that this is an exhaustive list. I'd like to say this is a suggested, because we want to give the providers out there, the supervisors, some guidelines to what types of work is acceptable, what types of work are not. Then you start putting the types of supervision in, and that muddies the water right there. You say, okay, well, you can test people after you have a lot of experience, but you have to be indirectly supervised for that.
I guess in my mind, that was helping create more of a framework and a structure for audiologists to use their professional supervisory experience to determine which category it should go in. So what kind of patient care is it provided? Is it using instruments to do tests, or is it just getting a case history? Can we somehow separate these into larger categories and then assign some sort of level of indirect supervision after so many hours, so that it kind of provides that consumer protection without being overly burdensome in the long run, where that over-the-shoulder is needed all the time. So
can we provide a certain amount of hours? Like you can have there's assistants are allowed indirect supervision after 300 hours, 400 hours, whatever.
And I don't know your audiology aids well enough for how you practice, so I'm just trying to go for the broader
But it can't be
framework.
300 hours of just greeting patients, right? It has to be something more substantial.
How do you guarantee that? Depends on the supervisor and how they're using the particular.
And if it's not documented and
Then
you were to
you
have it in
document
regs, then if they were violating that regulation, you would have an enforceable action at that point. That you didn't have documented so many hours of this, and then that person performed this task. That consumer complained about it, and then they would go back to you don't have the documentation to show that kind of thing.
I would also, I guess this would be in the sunset, we should, audiology assistants should renew their registration or license every 2 years and show, a list of where they worked and how long they worked and provide pay stubs or something.
I'm wondering if we could, the committee could work with staff to begin to develop newer language that may encompass suggested activities with supervision levels as we move towards sunset, because without taking a stand, just move towards sunset with some ideas that we could then take into our sunset report without, doing anything definitive.
And we also have actually work that has already been done. We have our efforts of an inclusive list of everything, all the tests that they could do, and the restrictive list. So we can actually work off of that. We've done a lot of this work already.
I recall it. It must be
I saw it briefly.
That stuff. So
then you would make a recommendation to the board that
Could we potentially, since we've done all this work already, could we potentially put up two potential recommendations for public comment? Negative list for public comment, and put a positive list for public comment, and see which one the public feels is more helpful for direction?
Right, so today you can direct staff to come up with maybe a negative and positive proposal to bring to the full board for their consideration, and then they can flesh it out a little bit more there. Maybe, also bringing, I don't want to say bringing the Audiology Aid into the times, but maybe with the idea too of looking for, a renewal cycle, maybe, anything else like that to kind of modernize and how to see how these aids are actually being used in real life. Unless you wanted to task a committee member to work with staff and to be available to assist them. Not trying to give you more work.
okay, so if the recommendation would be to have a committee member and/or a committee to work with the staff to come up with a list, a suggested list of don'ts.
Right. How would it look if you did it in the negative manner versus how would it look in the positive manner, taking into account ASHA and everything else that you have available? They might get halfway through it and see that the negative one is not going to work.
Okay, so they're really separate things, not an inclusive.
I think we need to address the effort to come up with regulatory language to address the aid issue. And then I think, on the other hand, out of that, we'll probably also be looking at the structure of the aid designation itself, addressing renewals, addressing some of the maybe qualifications.
I thought that was the big picture.
That is, right.
So in the meantime, should we be working with staff to try to develop, as Sabina's saying, that a positive list, a negative list, with supervisory designations accordingly, to begin that discussion anyway?
And I would also add that I think it would be beneficial to talk to the profession and ask, maybe have discussions with them before we start coming up with language. Get an idea of what the feeling is out there as far as what would be helpful. I think that's what Dr. Diaz suggested.
So do that ahead of putting out potential regulatory language for public comment.
Yeah, if at all possible.
Well, there's only really one avenue to do that, unless the board wants to take it upon itself to communicate with potential supervisors out there, as opposed to going through a professional organization.
Well, I think if CAA could help us, that would be great.
We'd have to ask them.
Mm-hmm. If not, we could still move forward with the language, some of the language and lists that we already have.
So can I recommend, though, that we do go ahead with that work of positive, negative lists with concomitant supervision, potential supervision, at the same time seeking assistance from the California Academy of Audiology, perhaps use their survey techniques to try to get at some of the issues that are out there. Surveys are terrible. You get 3% back, or 30% if you're lucky, so we won't get a lot, but those who care enough, perhaps they would, but we have to get the word out.
And not knowing CAA well enough, I'm going to venture a guess, having come from psychology, that they might have different regions or committees that are about professional practice or different things that we might be able to tap for that kind of a input. Maybe not? Okay.
Not that I recall. Now, they have individuals who certainly handle certain tasks, but they don't have committees necessarily that do that. But I don't know, not in the thick of that anymore. But we could certainly approach them with whatever mechanism they think would help us get the information, and not just from people who have an axe to grind, because certainly those people are out there. But people who have an honest input to help move us forward for consumer protection purposes.
So then committee just decides what the recommendation would be.
What do you think?
Is that a motion?
What do you think of that?
Yeah. That sounds good.
Okay, that we're going to do those two things.
Yeah.
Okay, those two action items.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
So, call the vote.
Before we
Oh,
do
yeah,
that,
public comment, excuse me.
Good afternoon. Bryce Doherty on behalf of HHP, the Hearing Healthcare Providers of California. I would agree this is a difficult task. We did do this about 4 years ago, I believe. We did have a list. It was very contentious. I think heading into sunset review next year is a smart venue for you to discuss this item. I think you need some assistance from the legislature, perhaps the Legislative Council, perhaps staff from the Senate and Assembly Business and Professions Committee. There are a number of, I would say, mid-level providers that in statute and in regs have very voluminous oversight and supervision requirements. So I think that would be smart. I would advise the board about singling out one specific group or organization that you're going to seek input from. If you want some robust input, I would suggest you open it up to all stakeholders that might be interested. And I think HHP would be more than willing to participate in that activity as well.
Can I just ask if HHP, are there providers out there that actually hire audiology assistants per se?
No, but I think our concern last time was if you're coming up with a positive list of things, last time there were some things on that list that we highly objected to, that we felt an audiology aid should not be doing in the interest of consumer protection. There was a kind of a belief at the time that an audiology aid can do anything that an audiologist can do as long as they're under the supervision of an audiologist. And I think you would have ENT physicians, I think you would CMA, I think you would have other people that would be very uncomfortable with that. So
well, that's what drove this whole discussion, is the fear of that they're being allowed to do more than they're qualified to do.
Yeah, since this is a public venue and you're a public board and your interest is consumer protection, I just would not like to see the board head in a direction where they're just seeking input from one particular organization. I think that's a delegation could be a potential delegation of state authority, and I think you should open it up to anybody who might be interested.
And I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I wasn't in any way saying that we were only going to go to one group. I think what we were looking at is some input on what would be useful to those in the profession that use the aids. And in the past, we did seek input from HHP, and we'll continue to do that. Thank you.
Okay, can we vote to move forward with those two aspects?
I move to move forward with those two aspects.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the motion carries, and I think that was the last.
That's it. We could take a break and then meet as a full board.
Okay, when we do that, take a break.
Call. Can we begin with Karen?
Karen Chang, public member.
Rodney Diaz, otolaryngologist, public member.
Marcia Raggio, audiologist, board member.
Dee Parker, speech-language pathologist, board member.
Todd Borges, hearing aid dispenser, board member.
Debbie Snow, public member, board member.
And at this time, if we have any members of the public who would like to introduce themselves, please do so.
Linda Pippert from the California Speech Language Hearing Association, board chair.
Hi. Oops. Holly Kaiser, speech language pathologist from the CASHA. I'm also a director at large.
Tanisha Graves, and I am the board's enforcement coordinator.
Bryce Doherty with the Hearing Healthcare Providers of California.
Karen Halbo with the Legal Affairs of DCA, and I'm your new Regulations Counsel. And I'm here to just take that little part off of Sabina's plate and slowly become better in working with Heather, who does a great job on your regs.
Thank you and welcome.
I also want to acknowledge that we have our legal counsel with us, Sabina Knight, who has been with us in the past and is here helping us from Legal Affairs. We also have our regulations analyst, Heather Olivares, with us, and Brienne Humphreys, our operations manager. And with us, we have our new assistant executive officer, who I'm going to introduce a little more in depth later, who many of you have met, Charisse Burns. And I'm Paul Sanchez, the executive officer of the board.
You gave me a copy. Okay. Is there any public comment for items that are not on the agenda? Okay. Then we'll move to the review and possible approval of the October 10th and 11th, 2019 board meeting minutes.
And that is behind tab 3.
I have a couple little technical or grammatical type of changes I can give to someone, very, very minor.
Okay. Any other? That's okay. Okay. We'll call the vote and start with Karen.
Is there a motion?
Yes.
Motion
to approve the minutes.
Is it seconded?
Second.
It's been approved and seconded that we have the reading of the board minutes and review. Are there any other comments?
Okay.
Okay. Then we'll call the question.
Call to vote?
Call the vote.
Okay. Yes.
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 Item 4, right?
Yes.
Okay. The next item is discussion and possible action regarding regulations as a result of AB 2138 licensing boards, denial of application, revocation, or suspension of licensure, criminal conviction, and this is as stated in Title 16 CCR, Sections 1399, 132, 1399, 133, 1399, 134, 1399, 156.1, 1399, 156.2, 1399.15653.
Okay, Heather Olivares, Legislation and Regulation Analyst, and you can find this under the full board section of the binder in tab 4. The board approved the AB 2138 regulations at the April 11 through 12, 2019 meeting. But as part of that, after the approval, the regulations need to go through a review process with the DCA legal office and then the agency. And so as part of that process, some changes have come from DCA legal that we need to take a look at and approve those changes. So I'll walk you through the biggest changes and just point out there are also some minor changes that you'll see in red that are to the authority and reference sections. Those are just to clarify where in the statutes those regulation sections are further defining. So I won't go into detail on those, but you'll see them in red. So if you turn behind the little orange paper, there's the actual regulation text, and the first big change is on page 2, and that's in section 1399.133. The revised language is to state, when considering the denial of a license or a temporary license under section 480 of the Business and Professions Code, on the ground that the applicant was convicted of a crime, or when considering the reinstatement of a license, the board shall consider whether the applicant made a showing of rehabilitation and is presently fit for a license. If the applicant completed the criminal sentence at issue without a violation of parole or probation, in making this determination, the board shall consider the following criteria. So this change is necessary to make it clear that this section applies to both denials and reinstatements. And then the language of changing eligible to fit is to make it consistent with the next section, 1399.134, where we use the word fit. Then the next big change is on page 5. And that's in section 1399.156.2. This is also dealing with denials and reinstatements, and the language is just changed to be the same. If you guys remember, because we have both practice acts, we have the Audiology, Speech Language Pathology Practice Act and the Hearing Aid Dispensing Practice Act. This is just making the exact same changes so that it's both the same in both of those acts. So does anyone have any questions about any of those changes? Do we need to ask for public comment?
Public comments, board discussion, public comment.
Are there any comments from members of the public?
Thank you. Okay. So this is a reg proposal. We're going to need that long special reg motion that nobody likes to read. Either I can read it and then one of you can so move, or I can pass my computer to anybody who wants to read it.
Interesting that you said anyone and you.
I did. You're right here.
Fascinating. Okay.
You want you? All right. It's being a brand new board member.
Okay, this is my hazing?
Yes.
Okay. I move that we approve the proposed text for a 45-day public comment period and delegate to the EO the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes if there are no adverse comments received during the public comment period, to follow established procedures and processes in doing so, and also delegate to the EO the authority to make any technical and non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rulemaking file. Is there a second?
Second. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion from members of the board? Okay, members of the public? Okay, then we'll call the vote.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
And just by way of update, we have been approved by agency for this package as well, so it'll be able to be submitted to OAL, and our official comment period will be starting on March 6th, so that's very exciting for our board. Okay, the next regulation package is in tab 5. So this is on the SLIPA regulations, and these were approved by the board at the May 31st and June 1st, 2018 meeting, and there were several forms, application and checklist forms that were going to be incorporated by reference as part of this package. However, 2 of these sections in these regulations conflict with regulations on increasing the fees for speech language pathology and audiology, And since that regulatory package is already in the internal review process, we wanted to make sure we got those regulations in place without these regulations moving forward and conflicting with that. So the changes are on pages 4 and 5 of the regulatory text, and it's sections 1399.170.13 and 1399.170.14. And strictly, the changes are just striking out those sections completely from this regulatory package. And then what will happen is once the fee regulations are in place, and assuming these regulations are still going through the process, we'll do another separate regulatory package in the future that is updating these sections that we're removing right now. And we'll need to make changes on our forms anyways because of AB 2138 is requiring us to not ask a question on criminal convictions anymore. So our forms need to be changed anyway, so it just makes more sense to do all of that at once rather than trying to move this package forward with conflicting language. So is there any questions on that?
No question. Any questions or comments? Okay. Is there a motion? Oh, we don't have to here.
There is a motion.
There is.
I'm going to go ahead and read it, and someone can decide if they would.
You can
read it. I move that we approve the proposed text for a 45-day public comment period and delegate to the executive officer the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes if there are no adverse comments received during the public comment period, to follow established procedures and processes in doing so, and to delegate to the executive officer to make any technical and non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rulemaking file. I move. Okay, Dick.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there further comment from members of the board? Public?
Linda Pippert, speech-language pathologist from CASHA. Under section 1399.71015, there's a large capital C. It looks like it's at the top of page 6. So the first sentence, I understand. The second sentence starts, the supervisor shall review client-patient records, monitor and evaluate assessment and treatment decisions of the speech-language pathology assistant. But speech-language pathology assistants don't evaluate or make treatment decisions.
That's all current regulation. That's the.
But it's not part of their scope of practice.
Is it supposed to be speech language pathologist, Linda?
It says the supervisor shall review
Right, but the
client
supervisor-
and patient and monitor and evaluate assessment and treatment decisions of the speech language pathology assistant. But my contention is they don't do assessments and they're not allowed to make treatment decisions.
They don't.
Yeah.
I wonder if the language, as it states, it's just a little confusing because it says treatment decisions of the speech and language pathology assistant and monitor and evaluate the ability of the assistant to provide services. So is the word treatment decisions maybe, I see what you're saying as you read it, but I'm wondering if there's a break there and it's the speech and language pathology assistant. It's referring to monitoring, evaluating their ability of the assistant to provide the services. You see what I mean in the sentence following?
But they can't make decisions.
Assistant.
That's the big thing about speech-language
No,
pathology.
I understand that. What I'm saying is the first half of that, which I understand what you're saying is not correct because they're not making decisions. The second half of that sentence that's after the word
I don't have a problem with
assistant,
the second half.
yeah, that I'm wondering if it should be speaking to that, not necessarily the first half.
Yeah, because there are people out in the community that misread some of these things, and they take it that whatever a speech pathologist delegates to a speech-language pathology assistant, it's okay, including doing assessments. And when they read language like this, they go, you can't tell me I can't let the assistant on my campus do that because it says right here, all the speech pathologist has to do is monitor. And there's other places in the legislation that says, it spells out what they cannot do, and it clearly says they can't make treatment decisions and they can't do assessments. So I think we have some conflicts there.
Linda, do you know if this has been discussed before as an issue?
I don't know. It just struck me today when I was rereading it, and
Might have been an oversight.
yeah.
Would we be able to, right now, have it crossed out and then?
Yeah, the board, I mean, we noticed all of these sections so on our agenda, so there's no problem to, if you want to tell me what you want it to read instead, it would be no problem to then approve it as revised at this meeting and keep moving it forward.
Thank you.
So we should just keep the first sentence and then take out the second sentence? No?
Portion of it.
Uh-huh.
So we want to get rid of treatment decisions.
Monitor and evaluate assessment and treatment decisions.
Shall review client-patient records, monitor and evaluate assessment. Is that still appropriate?
It seems like that whole sentence should be struck, and it should just start with,
Supervisor shall monitor.
Ensure.
it should say that the evaluate the ability of the assistant to provide services at the site, but it seems like that whole sentence prior, if I'm understanding what she's saying, that whole first sentence is actually inaccurate.
It is still reviewing client-patient records. Is that still appropriate?
Linda, did you have a specific suggestion that maybe we could consider?
I think you keep that part in and you
Right.
just take the second part.
My particular
Assessment and
suggestion
treatment.
would be to start at where it says, monitor and evaluate assessment and treatment decision of the speech-language pathology assistant. Take out that, just that phrase, that comma section. Because the rest of it, I believe, is totally accurate. The supervisor shall review client-patient records, absolutely, they should, and monitor and evaluate the ability of the assistant to provide services at the site where he or she is practicing, that's fine, and the particular clientele treated, absolutely, and ensure compliance with all laws and regulations governing the practice. So it's just that second comma section
Right.
in that sentence.
So it would read, the supervisor shall review client-patient records, monitor and evaluate the ability of the assistant, and the
Yep.
rest of it as it
Yep.
is.
Okay.
I think that would fix it. Thank you.
You.
I read that more than once. Yeah, I get it.
So is there any other input from members of the public? No.
Can I just redo the motion with stating that it's approved with these changes discussed.
Without reading the whole thing, it does say under D that during the first 90 days, supervisor will provide immediate supervision at least 20% of the work schedule. Where does it continue with what happens after 90 days without my having to read the whole thing? I mean, I did read it, but I don't find it.
I'm not certain on that either. It goes into more detail in E on the number of hours of CE, and then it goes on, that's on more CE. So it's just only that change on the immediate supervision in this one section.
So the way it reads would then, we would assume after 90 days, there's no percentage of supervision required? Immediate supervision?
Of immediate, yes.
That's what I mean.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's only restrictions or specific requirements for the first 90 days.
Do we need to spell that out?
Well, so the definitions in section 1399.170 will always apply in what can be done under direct supervision, what tasks have to have immediate supervision, and what tasks have to have immediate supervision. So all that is ongoing always, even after the 90 days. So it's not like once they've passed 90 days, they can suddenly do anything with no level of supervision or very limited supervision. It's still very limited in what is considered tasks that need direct supervision, what needs immediate, and what needs indirect.
So this is for all tasks, no matter what other type of supervision might be required of that task. Did we want to say at the end of that sentence, regardless of what task? So it's like it's all-encompassing supervision for 20% or more of that first 90 days?
So you mean to tie it back to the section 1399170?
I'm just trying to find a way to make it so that it's clear. You gotta do immediate supervision for 20% or more of that week, no matter what they're doing. Is that correct?
I think that's what it's. I think it's addressing the duration or the percentage, whereas the other section that Heather refers to is talking about specifics dealing with types of supervision. So
yeah.
It seems clear to me.
I think tying it back makes sense to me, though. So that it begs the question: okay, what after 90 days? Is it 10%?
But if they read the regulations and they read the types of supervision, they'll understand that this is just talking about those first 90 days. We want somebody to be there providing immediate supervision.
But I think the concern is if you're reading only this one section in a vacuum and you're not going back to 1399.170.
Where is that, by the way? I'm sorry. 1399.170.
It's the very first page of the document.
I had a proposed potential edit on that first page. At the very bottom, the last sentence about qualifications deemed equivalent by the board. What about adding the word valid in front of the word license? Valid and active, first page.
As opposed to being inactive?
A license.
Is that a typical? Would you say you would use that? Typically, you would say a valid license.
I mean, it's not a make it or break it moment, but it might come in handy later. Because you don't say what kind of license either.
It's kind of weird to say you have to be right there for 20% of the time in the first 90 days. And if you're doing these other tasks, you still have to be there all the time on site. Yep, we many times.
Linda Pippard, speech language pathologist. I think to your question on J, qualifications deemed equivalent by the board means a person who holds a license or has legal authorization to practice, because it also states in other places that a speech-language pathologist who has a clear credential from the CTC is also able to supervise them.
And that would be that legal authorization.
Yes.
That's also that would where the
And that would
credential-
only pertain to speech-language pathology assistants and speech-language pathologists working within the school systems in California.
Right. Okay. Right. That's what that legal authorization
which
of practice is.
I think it just begs to tie it back to these supervision comments, or like in D.
Page 1.
So we could even start that section D with some language kind of like notwithstanding the provisions in section 1399.170 requiring direct supervision, immediate supervision, or indirect supervision during the first 90 days, the supervisor shall do.
Maybe, yeah.
So I think what we're referencing, though, is 1399.170.2, right? Not the definitions, but the actual types of supervision and the requirements. And that's not in your handout, that's actually just in our Practice Act. Because that's where it talks about the different types of supervision that's required for duties performed by a SLPA. That's on page 129 of our law book.
That makes this even more confusing, this 90%, 20%, I mean, for 90 days, without tying it somehow.
So are you looking for like explicit language that says beyond the 90 days it's unsupervised? Is that kind of where you're?
Or certain, however the tasks are designated would be subject to the regular supervision, however they fall.
I think we have pointed out, refer them back to that language, so there's no confusion how it's supposed to go after 90 days.
I think that's a good idea too, because if you're just reading this one section in a vacuum and thinking, well, nothing else applies, I'm only worried about this one part.
What if we said in big D on page 6, during the first 90 days, the supervisor shall provide immediate supervision at least 20% of the week of the work schedule, regardless of the tasks performed by the SLPA, or regardless of the tasks performed. I don't know if that captures it. I'm trying to get around the difficulty.
Well, I think, what was your statement, Heather?
Notwithstanding the provisions in section 1399.172, if we want to do that, we can either reference it to that or reference it to the definitions of the level of supervision. Either way, I think.
Because 170.2 is that what actually defines the types.
Yeah, because basically you're getting 20% of your work week immediate supervision, no matter what you're doing.
Right.
No matter how they fall into the other categories. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think just by adding that and tying it to the other section, that people will then go, okay, I need to go reference what's happening in 1399.172, and that's what's going to continue happening after the 90 days.
Have a comment?
Yes, hi. Holly Kaiser, speech language pathologist. We just noticed, Linda and I, another section. It's 5A. I'm sorry, Linda, I don't know how to scroll up on your computer. It's about the qualifications of the supervisors. to refer to the section. I mean, to refer to the section it's in. Oh, it's at 1399.170.15. So under the requirements, 5A, it's the problem is the way it's written. It says that the supervisor must have at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed speech-language pathologist. So for someone that is a supervisor through being a credentialed speech-language pathologist with a clear credential versus a licensed speech pathologist, they would not have met that requirement of the 2 years of full-time experience.
And are you referring to because they work on like a 9 or 10 month? No.
Well, I'm referring to it because the way it's written, the intention, from what I understand, is that either a person with a clear credential or a license can be a supervisor. The way this is written, because it says and have at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed speech-language pathologist, then is going to restrict the person with a credential from being able to be a supervisor, because they wouldn't necessarily have been a licensed speech-language pathologist.
Okay.
It seems like what you'd want to have is that you're trying to say you want them to have at least 2 years of experience as a credentialed or a licensed would be the intention.
So I wonder if we can get to there by just striking the language that says as a licensed speech-language pathologist, because we're already talking about they must have a California license.
Correct.
Or a clear credential and 2 years of experience.
Yes. I think that would do it. Thank you.
Does everyone see where that is?
Yeah, I think it said, in the past, it said speech-language pathologist, and I think one of our attorneys recommended licensed, and I think the intent was to cover both of them.
Well, so are you saying we should repeat?
No, I'm just telling you what I recall from the conversation was and why we inserted licensed, because I think in the past it said 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a speech-language pathologist.
Some of them just have the credential.
Yeah, but they're not licensed.
I would think everybody is right now, but it might not be. It's a good point, Marcia.
So I'll just read what I have for changing that section so you guys can see if you agree with this change. But it'll say, possess and maintain a current valid California license as a speech-language pathologist as required in Section 2532 of the Code and Section 1399.160.3 of the California Code of Regulations, or may hold a valid and current professional clear or life, clinical, and or rehabilitative services credential in language, speech, and hearing issued by the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and have at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services, period. And actually, while we're in this section, I do have a question for either one of you. On the part for the different levels of credentials that can be issued by the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, is there actually one called professional clear, or life clinical? Because I've actually tried to look at the credentialing website, and it wasn't even really clear if there's 3 different credentials that can be offered.
Yeah, should ask her.
Yeah. Yes, there are. Yes. Yes.
That's come up in our office where we've been confused.
Well, Dr. Parker may be able to answer it since she was
We
very
got those
instrumental.
three, yeah.
She wrote that credential. But with the new credentialing, it's now a preliminary credential, which is not listed here because that wouldn't be appropriate because they wouldn't have those 2 years of work experience. The professional clear is what the newer credential says. But if we go back to the subgroup that still has a clinical or rehabilitative services credential, and then underneath it, it spells out speech and language specialist or services. You know, people of my age group up until, what, 2005? Yeah, up until 2005, that was the credential. And then those were either a clear or then you could get a life credential. So that's why there is that differentiation there. But people applying for a credential in 2020, that clinical rehab credential isn't even in existence and available for them. It's people that have been credentialed for a longer period of time, since 2005. And even them, some of them have converted over to the speech language pathology services credential. Yeah. Does that help?
Well, I wonder if it would make more sense to say clear, comma, professional clear, comma, or clinical and rehabilitation. This is kind of confusing how it is read, but I also don't want to mess up something that's put out by a different jurisdiction.
Yeah, to me it's not confusing because I've lived through it all, but yeah. I can understand why someone from the outside that is looking now at, like you said, as another entity, it could be confusing.
The reason why we addressed it in
Exactly,
the first place.
yeah.
The whole purpose for what we did was to clarify.
Okay.
Okay, so
Because you probably have a code section that says license also includes registration, probably in the
Right.
AAP code.
So the question is, the term, the sentence there that says 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed speech-language pathologist. I think that the original intent was that license would include credentialed, but since it's creating some confusion now, maybe we should clarify that. And maybe it should say credentialed or licensed, because one requirement is that you be licensed, but the other requirement is that you have 2 years of experience as a licensed speech-language pathologist. Yeah. And having dealt with unlicensed activity issues, I think that's something that we really need to make sure we have clear.
You don't want to inadvertently
right.
not include people with a credential just by leaving off that word. And I know that license and registration can be interchangeable, but not necessarily credential.
So maybe after license, they should just read or credential.
That's very definite. Yeah.
Or credentialed.
You could add credential, license or credential.
Is that enough detail on that? No, we have to say licensed or credentialed with the clear, or live clinical.
Stop it.
That was why we went in there.
Yes.
Okay.
So we have that edit, that change.
We didn't do a good job.
Yeah.
That's the way it's being used here.
Yeah.
It's the way it's being used.
Right, exactly.
And we added crystal clear.
Heather, did you want to walk us through every edit that we have so far on each page?
Yeah, actually, I just want to go over this one where we're at, just to make sure I have it right in my notes. So we're changing it to the possess and maintain a current valid license or credential, blah, 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 and at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed or credentialed speech-language pathologist.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So we're keeping the same part and then say, and have at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed or credentialed speech-language pathologist.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll go back to make sure we have everything we want to change. Back on 1399.170.
Page 1.
And that is in the beginning. did we want to add the language that was brought up of holding a valid license?
Yes.
Okay.
Tanisha says yes.
Okay. So that definition is going to read as, this is in J, qualifications deemed equivalent by the board means a person who holds a valid license or has legal authorization to practice. With the legal authorization to practice, that's for the SLPs using a credential. That's not language, but just for reference why that's there. The next change is going to be, well, on page 4 we have the strikeout that was originally brought to you. Page 5, also the strikeout in red that was brought to you. And then we're changing in 1399.170.15A is going to read, possess and maintain a current valid California license as a speech-language pathologist as required in Section 2532 of the Code and Section 1399.163 of the Code of Regulations, or may hold a valid and current professional clear, or life clinical or rehabilitative services credential in language, speech, and hearing issued by the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and have at least 2 years of full-time experience providing services as a licensed or credentialed speech-language pathologist. And then the next change we have is on page 6. We are striking out the language regarding monitor and evaluate assessment and treatment decisions of the speech-language pathology assistant and then on section D, we are changing that to say, notwithstanding the provisions in section 1399.172, during the first 90 days, the supervisor shall provide immediate supervision at least 20% of the week of the work schedule. That is all the changes I have. Any questions, concerns?
Okay, was everybody able to follow along with those edits? Mm-hmm. It can be very confusing, I know. Good job. All right, so since we have additional edits after the last time we motioned and wanted to move this language forward, which thank you so much, that's why we have such great public participation, we're going to have to do another motion. So I will go ahead and read that motion again with our edits that Heather was just so kind enough to walk us through. And then I will go ahead and read that motion again, and we can kind of start over with this new language. I move that we approve the proposed text for a 45-day comment period and delegate to the executive officer the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes if there are no adverse comments received during the public comment period, to follow established procedures and policies in doing so, and also delegate to the executive officer the authority to make any technical and non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rulemaking file.
Second?
Oh, I need a
Needs a motion.
I thought that was the motion.
Well, but I'm not a board member.
Oh.
A motion?
Second?
Now we have a first and a second.
Yeah, it's been first and seconded. Is there any further discussion by members of the board? Public?
Good job.
Okay, then let's call the vote.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Good job.
Thank you.
We're on to item 6.
Okay, so item 6 is regarding the RPE direct supervision requirements and remote or telesupervision requirements. We saw this language at the April 11th through 12th, 2019 meeting, and the board approved the RPE telesupervision regulations, including adding a definition of direct supervision and telesupervision. This started through the DCA internal review process, and our legal counsel requested some additional clarification on some of the language. And so in your packet is a memo that outlines the issues for discussion. We're going to need to work through these issues and make changes to the regulatory language. So if you guys want to turn to your memo, and then I'll point out where in the memo and tie it to where in the language changes are needed. So a lot of it is going to be on page 1 of the regulations in the actual definitions for direct supervision and telesupervision. The first issue that was brought up is to clarify visual personal observation and defining what does it mean, why isn't personal observation enough, and how else can a person observe something if not through visual means. And you can find this in the definition of both direct supervision and telesupervision, so we'll need to discuss how we want to revise that.
Are they trying to say there, are you actually in the room, or are you really doing watching?
Just wondering how the logistics of E, telesupervision, how does that physically work? Supervisors video monitoring the provider, the RPE, who is talking to a patient via video.
Yeah, and we don't really specify any specific type of technology of how they want to accomplish that. We're just defining what it is and defining and limiting the parameters of when it can and can't be used. But we're not getting involved into what exactly that's going to look like.
These are in cases of telepractice.
Well, not even necessarily that. The RPE can be in the room with the person, with the client, but their supervisor is remote and watching those.
Yeah.
So it's not
necessarily the patient also.
It's not teletherapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just supervision.
Right.
Linda Pippert, speech pathologist.
Yeah.
It probably could be both. It could be supervision remotely through visual when someone's doing telepractice. It also could be, as you described, that the RPE is working with someone and there's a camera recording or visually live streaming
Observing what they're doing.
the observation. And I think the reason that visual was added in there so that no one would be confused that they were just hearing it, but they actually had to see what was going on as well.
Yeah, I tangled with that as well, Linda.
Yeah, we definitely discussed this very thoroughly at our last meeting, but And we can just choose not to make any changes, but these are issues that have been brought up by legal, so we want to try to address it if we can so that we can keep this moving forward.
Linda, do you know why or can you think why here, the visual, I was just saying to Marcia,
Yes.
I know that we have colleagues who deal with the auditory as well, not just the visual.
Yes. And I think that the supervision, I mean, we could add visual and auditory so that they're not just seeing
Right.
over, they're not just getting a silent picture, if you will,
Right.
from the
No, that's my concern
supervisee.
here. There is the auditory as well.
Yeah. And then the reverse would be someone is there in person, but they're sitting behind a shield and they can hear what's going on, but they can't see how the RPE is interacting with the client.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, rather than taking the visual out, perhaps auditory
add the
needs to be
auditory
added
in.
in. You
Rather
said they were
than-
also asking about guidance. That was an interesting question.
And if I remember correctly, at the last meeting when we discussed the personal observation, we didn't want it just like multiple screens going on at the same time.
Oh.
And that they were actually focused on the one interaction between the client and RPE. They're only monitoring one person at that time versus having a lot of screens and watching multiple people.
I don't think I would know that from this.
I wouldn't either.
I've supervised a lot of RPEs in my day, and I would never have thought of trying to supervise more than one at a time, but very interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's why we added the personal. But
does that do it?
But does
It doesn't say it's a one-on-one.
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot to be fleshed out here to make it really clear exactly what we want that supervision to look like.
The part on guidance, I know that you said that was a question, but what is it about guidance that maybe we can help define?
So we were talking about, do you when you think of the word guidance, you're thinking about, okay, now you do this step, and then you do this step. And we're not necessarily doing that when the supervision is happening. It's more the supervisor is watching what the RP is doing, but isn't telling them step by step what to do.
Right. Wouldn't that be like, so you observe, but I've never done this, so you'll have to tell me. You're not like interjecting, like, hold it there.
It depends.
Okay.
If an RPE
That's right.
starts giving a test and they're mispronouncing the words, I have been known to stop them because they will not get reliable results. Or perhaps a stimuli was not presented appropriately and the kid didn't understand. So rarely do I do that because at this point they should be much more independent. So I understand your concerns about, no, we're not going step by step by step. Do we sometimes have to interrupt on the rare occasion?
Right, if something goes bad.
Yeah, but usually we're taking notes during the observation, we're watching, we have a consultation with them after the observation,
right.
Give them feedback on what went well, what you can work on, here's some resources to further develop those skills, or we will sometimes model for them a technique or an approach with that to use with that particular kind of client.
And aren't those somewhere else already, are those requirements elsewhere already in the regs?
I think they come under what we would consider training and experience.
Right, okay.
So I don't know that we'd usually have further information on that.
I
but
don't know if we
kinda
do a
covers
deeper
it.
dive in a description.
No, we wouldn't. No, I don't
Right,
think
yeah.
that point.
So I'm trying to figure
That's
out
not-
what we put in a definition of what kind of supervision.
Yeah,
where
there
we draw
may
the
be a
line.
more appropriate word.
And you wanted to add the word audiology or audio.
Well, auditory.
Auditory. Sorry. Because you can have visual observation without sound.
Yeah. And I demonstrated you can have auditory without the visual, and you should be doing both.
Okay.
You
It
need to
should be
see.
simultaneous.
You need to see what they're doing. You need to hear what they're doing.
Okay. So it would be visual and auditory personal observation.
I think you might want to define the personal, because
Yeah.
personal to me doesn't necessarily mean one-on-one, and that's
Means,
what it
so
is.
you could say direct supervision means one-on-one, could you, in-person, visual and auditory observation. You don't need the word personal, because
yeah, because you're already saying one-on-one. Yeah,
Right.
that you're there. Yeah. Maybe instead of guidance, the RPE supervisor is available to provide feedback and comments, something along those lines, instead of just guidance.
in-person, visual and auditory.
Instruction if applicable. You've done this before.
Observation.
Okay, what did she say?
Her offering was instruction as applicable.
As needed?
As needed. Yeah. You think that would clear up their confusion?
So, let's see.
I think guidance.
We could say guidance
What
is
you like,
needed, too.
Already.
Since we're adding it,
Yeah.
it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
You can keep the word guidance and just put as needed. So you could say direct supervision means one-on-one, in-person visual and auditory observation and guidance as needed by the RPE supervisor as of activities, and then we have this other issue with the last part of the phrase. You either leave it as is, but there's potential clarity issues with that, or you can say related to the practice of speech language pathology or audiology.
But does an audiologist even do an RPE now? It sounds like it's a whole different program. Do you call it an
I think they
RPE?
still do, don't
Do
they?
they call
Oh,
They call it
okay.
They call
Okay.
it RP.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
You could-
It's defined as an RP in our practice act. They
Yeah.
they
Right.
call it something different.
You guys. Okay, did you want me to read that one more time?
Well, did we decide
I don't know.
On the part on related to the field for licensure of separating out related to either audiology or speech language pathology?
Well, because in subsection A above, you say the first sentence references the supervised practice of speech language pathology or audiology. You could just use the practice, you can use that same phrase instead, that way you capture both, because now I hear both audiologists and speech language pathologists do RPEs.
Yes.
You should just stay up here.
Yeah, it's just supervisor.
Just stay.
That's why I asked you.
I got a comment from Brittany Sheldon, who obviously is watching us live stream because she's not here. And she recommended the terminology real-time feedback was her suggestion.
Oh, instead of guidance?
Yes.
As needed?
So,
That sounds like we're with the
It
times.
doesn't clarify anything.
No, we had real time
What?
before. We had real time before.
And took it out.
That was-
Just leave
Yeah.
it.
And there was a reason for it to go, obviously.
Our legal staff had a problem with real time and what it actually meant, right? We were looking for definitions of real
Right.
time. We couldn't.
Yeah.
Okay, can we do Hamilton and then no more happen? because I think that's what they're after.
Yeah,
You're there.
you're in the
In
room.
real time. And
Well, and like she said, you may not have to give any guidance or instruction ever,
Right.
but you may have to intervene.
But I want auditory.
Right, okay, so. So we could, I'm not proposing this, I'm just reading like my random notes here. Direct supervision means one-on-one, in-person, visual and auditory observation and either guidance as needed or instruction as needed by the RPE supervisor of activities related to the practice of speech-language pathology or audiology.
I like guidance the best. Encompasses every kind of interaction. You could provide instruction, you could provide an observation, you can...
If it says one-on-one, do we need the visual and auditory? Or is one-on-one just...
I think that was her point about being in the room. Maybe there's a
I see.
screen
I
there,
see what
and
you're
then,
saying.
or maybe she's observing it visually only.
Okay. I was picturing them right there.
I think there's a couple different ways they do it. I'm not an expert at all.
It is being in the room.
And I just want to point out, I think that the one-on-one should come after in person, because it's more tied to the visual and auditory observation.
In-person, one-on-one, visual and auditory observation, and guidance as needed by the RPE supervisor of activities related to the practice of speech-language pathology or audiology.
Sounds good.
Now we got both in. Auditory and visual.
And then the telesupervision would be telesupervision means one-on-one visual and auditory observation and guidance as needed through electronic video monitoring by the RPE supervisor of activities related to the practice of speech-language pathology or audiology while care is being provided to the patient.
For telesupervision, would the term synchronous be a useful substitute for real time?
Yeah, they use that in online learning, right? Asynchronous,
Yeah, it's a very specific definition for telehealth, telemedicine.
Right.
Thank you, Rod, because I was just going to bring up that our profession is moving rapidly into telepractice. It's a huge area. So I agree.
We use a single word, audiovisual, instead of visual and auditory.
That's why you're the experts. AV Club. Good job.
So synchronous means at the moment, at the time, not recording it, looking at it later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Asynchronous.
Yeah.
They're both important, but they both look at the same. The auditory is different.
Yeah, I would think in these professions. Are we done? Can we move to? Do we make the corrections?
I don't know if we're done.
Okay, so if you guys want to turn on to the next page, Some other changes that were made is changing insuring to ensuring, since we are not talking about insurance here. And then we're changing in this at the one, telesupervision of the RPE temporary license holder may be utilized in lieu of direct supervision if it meets the following requirements. And the feedback we got from legal counsel is that direct supervision and telesupervision are two separate things. So the reg should be clear that either telesupervision is being used or direct supervision is being used. They're not interchangeable. And then the change in C, where we're removing the language, the same standard of care is exercised when providing telesupervision as when providing any other mode of supervision. And this was suggested to be removed because there's no definition of what a standard of care is, and therefore there's no way to enforce that requirement is being met. And then we made changes in C and D, removing the language for this is direct supervision, and again, that's because telesupervision and direct supervision are two separate things. So then the other change that we need to discuss is on page 3. I added some language that's meant to be kind of a catch-all that states the RPE supervisor determines based on their professional judgment that other issues or conditions exist that make the use of telesupervision inappropriate in that given situation. And this is broader than the other two areas where we outline when telesupervision is appropriate and when it's not, based on the RPE supervisor's professional judgment. But this is more if there's issues that aren't directly related to the level, the RPE's level. It's not based on their competency at all, but if there's other issues, and that could be an issue with the patient that is being seen that may make it where telesupervision isn't appropriate for that particular person. And so we wanted kind of something in there to allow the RPE supervisor to say, well, I think this isn't an appropriate time for telesupervision to be used, kind of like a catch-all.
That's fair.
And if there's any feedback on making that more clear, I'm open to any suggestions, but that was kind of something we came up with just to give the RPE supervisor a little more discretion.
There's some grammatical and punctuation errors in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You say a singular supervisor, you can't say their professional.
Right.
And,
Also, it should be determines, comma, based on the professional judgment, comma, that. So it has to be his or her or.
There is appropriate. There can be used when you're not specifying gender.
For a singular noun?
Yeah.
Show me that.
Yeah.
Show me that.
The elements of style.
Yeah.
My white and strunk book would not agree with you. Or strunk and white.
Strunk and white.
No.
Are we looking at big F on the top of?
yes.
Okay. Right below it, too, I want to point out that in little d, the word personal observation is also in there. I'm not sure if this is a time to, if you want to change that or if it's still okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying that you got rid of the word personal somewhere else.
We did.
You might want to, just reword it so maybe that's not an issue. Yeah.
We did take
One.
just perhaps recommending to change the that to an if. In big capital F.
So the RPE supervisor determines based on their professional judgment if other issues or conditions exist that make use of telesupervision inappropriate.
So then to Sabina's point, do we want to change D underneath that? Do we want to just strike out the personal, or do we want to tie it back to the audio visual?
Well, what if you just take out, what if you say direct supervision of the RPE temporary license holder may consist of, colon, and you don't, do you need the personal observation, or you can say, yeah, you don't need that part.
So just may consist of the following.
May consist of the following. Yeah, because we don't need to say what kind of observation it is. We've already done that.
Direct has already been defined elsewhere.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's
yeah, so don't need all that.
If I could reiterate, because of the fact that telepractice is rapidly growing, this is really important because it's kind of going in this direction.
Is there anything else, Heather?
No, that was it.
Did you want to walk through every edit again to see if we hit it all and got it all and everybody understands?
Okay, so the first change on the first page, direct supervision means in-person, one-on-one, audio-visual observation and guidance as needed by the RP supervisor of activities related to the practice of speech-language pathology or audiology.
Good job.
And then E is telesupervision means synchronous, one-on-one, audio-visual observation and guidance as needed through electronic video monitoring by the RPE supervisor of activities related to the practice of speech-language pathology or audiology. And then we're changing, okay, on page 2 is all the changes we went through, but we didn't make additional changes to those changes. And then on F, I'm going to need Marcia to repeat some of it, but I have the RPE supervisor determines based on his or her professional judgment if other issues or conditions exist that make use of telesupervision inappropriate in that given situation. And there were some other changes you have.
Just said.
The legislature has moved to the use of the
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. If the supervisor determines, comma, based on their professional judgment, comma.
Okay. And then do you guys want to stay with their or change to his or her?
Would you say the legislature
Yes.
okayed the use of that?
Yeah, they want to be more gender neutral.
Non-binary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be purists, you know.
I haven't seen her in a while.
I'm
And then the other
S
change.
slash HE. You're seeing that?
Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
And then the other change we have is in D, direct supervision of the RP temporary license holder may consist of the following.
Great. Okay.
Ready for a motion?
Good thing I know it by heart, right? Okay, I move that we approve the proposed text for a 45-day public comment period and delegate to the executive officer the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes if there are no adverse comments received during the public comment period, to follow established procedures and processes in doing so, and also delegate to the executive officer the authority to make any technical and non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rulemaking file.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
I have a motion to do what she said.
Exactly what you said.
Perfect.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Or comments from the public? Okay, then we'll call the roll.
Yes.
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 Yes. And now we'll take a break.
All right.
My mom called me twice.
Okay.
So this is the last. All right. We've changed the agenda somewhat. We're not going to number 7. We're going to number 8. And this will be the last item of the day. It's a discussion and possible action on regulatory changes regarding the maximum number of support personnel that a speech-language pathology supervisor can supervise.
Okay, so the board received the enclosed written public comment from a licensed speech-language pathologist, Tracy McDonald, regarding the supervision of SLPAs. The request made in the public comment that we received is that the board consider revising the regulations to allow the equivalent of supervision of 2 full-time SLPAs. In your memo, I put in there the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Division 13.4, Section 1399.170.16, specifies that a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 support personnel, not more than 2 of which hold the title speech-language pathology assistant. Support personnel includes speech-language pathology assistants and speech-language pathology aids. So the concern raised in the letter that we received is regarding part-time SLPAs that are working less than 20 hours per week. And Tracy McDonald has requested that the board consider changing that to be the equivalent of 2 full-time SLPAs.
Doesn't the reg already limit the maximum, right? We're giving a maximum, not a minimum.
Right, so currently you can only supervise 2 SLPAs, whether they're part-time or full-time SLPAs, you can only supervise 2.
Isn't it 3? Not more than 2, which could be SLPAs,
2
right?
SLPAs, yeah, and so it's basically you can do 2 SLPAs in 1 aid, or you can do 2 aids and 1 SLPA. Like, you can do any combination, but the max of SLPAs you could ever have is 2.
Sorry, and she wanted?
She wants to, so she has some SLPAs working for her that only work part-time. They're mothers, or they're going to school, furthering their education, and are only available part-time hours. So her request is that if you're supervising people less than 40 hours per week, that you can take those SLPAs and their hours and make it equal to be 2 full-time SLPAs.
So, meaning she would like to have 4 or 5?
Yeah, she'd like to have multiple SLPAs.
Full-time equivalents, yes.
She says she's got.
So
Is the notion that she's not supervising these people all at the same time?
Well, I mean, her request is to change the regs. We can change the regs or not change the regs, and if we choose to change the regs, we can specify they have to be on different shifts.
I mean, that makes sense to me, that if she had a 5 people and they were all spread out over the week, never overlapping with each other, there's some logic to that.
Yeah, but her request is not that specific, right?
Yeah.
But of course, you guys can make it however specific you want, if you even want to pursue a regulatory change at all. So that's the request that's been made, and is up for discussion. If you even want to address changing it, then we could come up with some language at a future agenda item for changing that.
I'm curious what type of paperwork or supervisor capacity is there entailed in supervising them? Because if it's up to 2 full-time, if I could have 8, 2 hours a day at different times, but then depending upon what is required to actually supervise them beyond watching them do work, has there become a point of diminishing return in what I can really actually do? I mean, that's kind of possibly an unrealistic, an exaggeration, but we leave the door open, the door is open. So, I'm wondering what's entailed in supervising them beyond just watching them work.
There is definitely review of report writing and all of that is entailed.
Some of the stuff we just talked about in our regulations.
Yeah. And all of those provisions would still stand, so it would kind of be up to the supervisor if they could they would still have to meet all those requirements, so it's up to them if they can handle that workload.
Now, I see this reg was operative in 2001. Have we gone back and seen the intent behind it? Because there must have been a public protection type of intent behind why there was a limit, why there was a cap, what's the harm, was there harm being done? I think it might be worth looking into that intent from 2001. Why were these numbers picked?
I think the harm potentially is SLIP is doing the job of an SLP.
Mm-hmm. Or the lack of
plainly simply, because we do not have enough practitioners.
And it was a new license type back then, and I think that the people that got together thought this was an appropriate amount at the time. I do think that looking at it from an administrative standpoint, from an enforcement standpoint, it could create problems. I mean, we would have to look at it and make sure that we're not opening the door, as Todd said, a door that we can't shut later on.
It's a slippery slope, a very slippery slope.
But I do understand the concerns. I just have to. I guess we'd have to really think through how we would administer that.
Mm-hmm.
Might there be any benefit from looking at how other states handle this? We could look.
Yeah, I haven't done any research on it because this is purely if you even want to move forward. I mean, if you don't want to move forward, then there's no point in using staff resources when it's going to be a straight no, we're not going to address this issue. But definitely if it's something we want to explore and put on a future agenda item, then of course we can do the research, we can bring back language, and move forward with a regulatory package.
Okay.
My thoughts are if there's a really compelling reason to expand, then we can use those resources, but I don't see a real compelling reason to expand from a board standpoint, so I don't think we should.
Okay. Are there any other comments?
Well, just one offhand comment. Even if so a lot of employers would rather do part-time because they don't have to pay benefits. So, this can open up for somebody to be able to do, have double their staff and basically have full-time equivalents and save money on healthcare, whatever savings plans and whatnot. So, so that it can open that up if we were to do it.
When there's already a shortage of SLPs as it is, and then we're going to have multiple SLPAs and even more SLPAs with less supervisors able to supervise.
Well, is that part of her driving point? Is that because there are so few, then there might be a need to be able to have more under supervision? Otherwise, maybe some are not being able to complete their program if they don't have the supervision, because they can't get someone to supervise them because they're full, if you will.
She's actually saying that it limits her ability to hire. She doesn't really talk about that there's a shortage of supervisors.
Well, I'm just wondering if we're going to look at possibly opening this up, that would be the only reason I could see to have a motivation to open it up, is if there is an actual shortage out there, that there's an actual need to be able to have more people being monitored by one individual, because there aren't people out there to do that. If there isn't, then to me it's
I think
it seems
one thing I
unnecessary.
noticed was she wasn't talking about hiring a new SLP.
Right.
She wanted SLPAs.
Well, and again, it's, if it's because there aren't enough SLPs to monitor all the SLPAs out there, and you need more SLPAs for more SLPs in your industry, then that might be a valid reason for looking at it. But if there isn't that issue, then I don't see a reason for opening it up.
I don't understand her comment. It also limits the graduate student in finance of their graduate programs.
Which has nothing to do with. We know about that, Linda.
Yes. Linda Pippert, speech language pathologist. A lot of the graduate students will work as an SLPA during their graduate training. So it's a way for them to be in the field and working while they're completing their graduate education to be a speech language pathologist.
And a way to make money while they're at it? Is that
Yes,
her point?
yes. And hopefully not take out so many student loans, I'm sure.
I think, like a lot of you have already echoed the same kind of comment, we have to keep in mind our public protection mandate. And absolutely, I think, well, and again, obviously it's your choice, but you really have to keep that in mind. We're here to protect the consumers. We're here to make sure that the laws and regulations that you promulgate will continue to do so.
If I could just add to that, I don't supervise SLPA, so I kind of have no skin in the game. What I hear in the community, that especially people that own private clinics and provide early intervention, they're the ones that seem the most concerned about this issue. And they almost see it the flip side of what you're talking about, in that there aren't enough SLPs to supply the services, but if we have the ability to supervise more SLPAs, then we have supervised SLPAs providing those services, so children are getting served, even if it's not at the top of the license, if you will.
And Linda, what goes along with that is the fact that I am one who had a post-baccalaureate, still do, a post-baccalaureate certificate program. I never allowed any one of mine to ever become a SLPA based on their coursework as a post-bac student. However, we have documentation of, in our own state, universities that have been doing that very thing. They gave them the post-bac program, which is the equivalent of a BA, and then tacked on that SLPA, and away they went. It honestly was a great moneymaker for the university, but there were no slots for these people to go into an MA or an MS program, and therefore we see this explosion of people who want to be a SLPA, and the SLPs aren't there.
Also,
You can see not a one-sided issue at all.
Yeah, absolutely. like most issues.
just as an aside, the Chancellor's Office, CSU Chancellor's Office, has given, I think, over $100,000 in grants to SLP graduate programs to try to increase their enrollment. And we just got our money and taking 10 more students.
May I publicly thank you because not every CSU is doing this.
So, what would benefit the public the most? To increase the amount of SLPAs?
Well, I think.
Well, what would benefit the public the most?
I'll take this, increased faculty. So that exactly what Marcia's doing. She took the money from the chancellor's office and now has 10 more students. If each of our programs took 10 more students, that would make a big difference. But
then they,
in terms of this, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of this.
Terms of this. Oh, for her.
So I don't. I'm not sure that allowing her 2 full-time.
Aren't going to make that much.
You're asking what would benefit as far as whether we allowed more
what would
personnel.
benefit the industry, right? That would help people more, because obviously we need more speech pathologists. Would opening it up to allow them to not just have 3 but maybe 4?
Well, this is not going to increase the number of speech language pathologists. This is going to increase the number of assistants. So right. I think that I think Linda just said it's a kind of a. There's 2 sides to this that one could benefit, but it could also be problematic at the same time. Now, looking at our enforcement workload and some of the issues that we see. I have Tanisha Graves here who coordinates enforcement for us, and she's well aware that we're seeing more and more issues of SLPAs working unsupervised or that are working in an unlicensed capacity. So I think that this will allow someone to hire more SLPAs. The question is, does this address a shortage? Is there a shortage of SLPAs?
No, there's a shortage of SLPs.
So the question is, does this contribute to the problem or does it solve a problem? And I'm not sure of what the answer to that is.
But in order,
this will
some
employ more.
SLPAs becomes SLPs, right?
They try.
Problem is they can't get in. And some of them, I mean, people are turned down with 3.8, 3.9 GPAs. Not that they aren't qualified, but in many instances down where we are, right, Linda? It's what we see. They've worked hard, they've done a good job, and they can't get in.
Okay. I would say most of our students who become SLPAs are academically insufficient. They're not the 3.8, 3.9, at least in the Bay Area. And they're actually the poorer students. And they can't get into graduate school, but they like the field, so they choose to be a SLPA. Not because of the talent they bring.
Yeah.
Those Southern California people must be just better.
But I think trying to get to your original point is, if we add more SLPAs, will that benefit the public because there's a need where there are people not being serviced that can be serviced if there are more SLPAs available?
I don't think there is.
Or, I mean, that's for me, that's kind of where it comes at. If there's not necessarily a public outcry for more help in this area, then all we're doing is just adding more people into a field where they're not.
Yeah.
Where they have nowhere to go.
I think there's enough SLPAs. I think there's probably not enough SLPs.
Well, and I think that's this person's point, is because there's not enough SLPs to take the SLPAs, then we should I think what she's saying is
increase.
I should be allowed to take more because there aren't enough of us to take them. And so that's where.
Yeah, but does she have the time to?
Well, and that's where we
get
gets down to, okay, if it's 40, if it's 80 hours, how many people are you going to cram into the 80 hours?
Yeah.
So we'd have to be very specific in the number. So then, what number do we pick? It's 3 now. Do we say 4? Do we say 5? I mean, it becomes somewhat arbitrary.
We don't have evidence that SLPAs are having a hard time finding supervisors. At least I haven't seen or heard anything like that. What I do have is data that shows that there's a certain number of SLPs in the state and a certain number of SLPAs, and I want to say that's somewhere between 4 and 5 to 1 ratio. SLPAs are always our fastest growing licensing population. I mean,
keep
if you look at our
that
numbers,
number. I keep watching that number.
they've more than doubled in the last 5 years. SLPs have grown too by even more.
Oh, okay.
I mean, 3 times the amount.
So
they
we
were
don't
5 years ago.
we don't really have a problem.
I don't know. I don't know that I can say that we don't. I just don't have any evidence that says that we do.
So we don't have any evidence that says we have a problem. Okay.
Looking at consumer protection, I'm always caught between the idea of, yes, if we could provide more providers to provide services, maybe that's a better consumer protection thing. But if we're saying, well, it's better than nothing provider, then is that a good consumer protection thing? You know, we can't get SLPs, so let's get these guys because they're willing, they're warm bodies still breathing. Let's put them in there. You know, is that a good consumer protection?
But that would just lead to people saying, oh, goody, we can get them on the cheap and we'll get them fast and good for us. And they will not be prepared to do the job that especially our kids in the schools need.
That's what I worry about.
That's what I always hear from speech pathologists. They don't like the idea of SLP as necessarily maybe a necessary evil, and want them regulated as much as possible, but don't really think they bring the skills that you'd like them to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, how would you? Yeah. Do you have to respond to her? Do you have to send, or does Paul have to respond?
No.
You don't have to do anything.
No, we can just. The only thing we would need if you wanted to move forward is a motion to move forward and what you wanted to do. But it sounds like if you don't want to change the regulations, then we've discussed it.
A clear benefit to consumers,
Yeah.
and that's why we're here.
Right. I think what struck me, she wasn't talking about trying to hire SLPs. She wanted SLPs. That's who she wanted.
Okay.
We're adjourned until tomorrow morning. Thank you for helping us through this.